trapping carbon to prevent warming. That's the promise offered by CCS Technology. And now, Norway's pitch for a new business. A big oil exporter, the country plans to store CO2 on behalf of polluting industries, burying their emissions deep in the ocean.
We are now at the Brevik cement plant. We are building the world's first carbon capture facility in a cement plant. Cement is the glue in concrete, and concrete is the most produced product in the world. So we need concrete to build our society. Cement industry is called hard to abate sector because when we are producing cement, we are using energy to heat up the limestone, the raw material for our production. We can cut some emissions by using alternative fuels, alternative raw materials, but at the end, we still have emissions from our chimneys. So we need to capture the CO2 in that flue gas. This is called CCS, carbon capture and storage. So we have emissions on approximately 800,000 tons of CO2. We're going to capture half of that, 400,000 tons of CO2 every year. 400,000 tons of CO2 equals around the emissions from 200,000 fossil cars. So it's quite a lot of CO2. We produce the cement as before and divert the flue gas into this carbon capture system. In this tower, the CO2 gas is absorbed by a liquid amine, and then the CO2 is released from this liquid. The CO2 is then compressed and cooled down so it's liquid. We need a lot of energy for this. If we're going to capture more than 50%, we would need a lot more energy. We would need an energy plant next to us, and we don't have that. This plant we are constructing here is around 450 million euros, so it's quite a lot of money. There is a cost of installing carbon capture in the industry, but the alternative is worse. We need to capture the CO2 to reduce the emissions. And I also think it's possible to see that the cost will be lower in the future when we learn from projects like this. So this is a financial good development, in my opinion.
Many heavily polluting industries are now banking on carbon capture and storage. Norway could soon become a graveyard for their emissions. The country has launched a cross-border storage service for emitters. Take a cement plant based in Europe. Once their CO2 has been captured from their chimneys, it will be cooled to a liquid state, taking up 600 times less volume. It is now ready to be shipped to a terminal in Norway. From there, the CO2 will travel through pipelines all the way to the North Sea, where it will be injected into rock formations 2,600 meters below the seabed, its final resting place. Dubbed Northern Lights, it was born out of a public-private partnership, the Norwegian government funding 80% of the costs, the remaining 20% coming from 3 oil majors: Norway's Equinor, British Dutch Shell, and French Total Energy. And when it comes to CO2, these fossil fuel giants have a few years of experience under their belts. They began injecting carbon into the deep layers of the seabed in the 1950s, a technique to add more pressure and recover more oil in aging fields. Now, in the climate crisis era, it has taken on a new dimension. Northern Lights plan to store 1.5 million tons of CO2 every year on behalf of their clients, 5 million before the end of this decade.
What I have in my hand here is a piece of rock from the Aurora Formation where we will store CO2. But above it, we have this waterproof rock, which makes sure the CO2 stays in place. Here, Northern Lights are building the world's first CO2 terminal. Most places in the world, you cannot do CCS because you don't have the geology. Norway, and more specifically offshore Norway, have the right geological conditions for storing CO2. That means you have a porous rock deep below the seabed where you can actually inject the CO2 into. And that is sealed by other layers of rock above it that keeps it in place. At a certain stage, you reach a pressure where you say, now we do not want to expose the rocks above our formation for a higher pressure. And that's when we stop, and then we will continue to monitor that field, that area, to make sure that we have control over the CO2. You need the geology, but you also need expertise to drill the wells and put in all the infrastructure around it, which is typically being developed by the oil and gas industry. It is the French TotalEnergies, it is Shell, and it's the Norwegian Equinor. They each own 1/3 of this company. In order to bring the CO2 from where it is emitted, we can use a ship. But if there is a lot of CO2, then down the road, I think pipelines will be a very interesting alternative to transport large amounts of CO2. We have entered into 2 agreements already. First of all, with Yara, an international producer of fertilizers, and they have a plant in the Netherlands. We have agreed to take 800,000 tons per year of CO2 from this facility. I believe Norway can play a role to help EU with storing the CO2 that they have. And I believe that it can also be an interesting business for Norway as it builds on the competence Norway has developed over the 50, 60 years of oil and gas production.
By agreeing to store carbon from other countries across the EU, Norway is in fact encouraging European countries and the European Union to continue to rely on oil and gas for the future. The project isn't that big. It's 5 million tons that they plan to store. That's around 10% of Norway's domestic emissions. So also trying to brand this as like, this will save the world, is a bit too much, to be honest. In the past, there has been several different carbon capture and storage projects from across the world. Some projects have successfully stored carbon, but some have also ended up leaking carbon. And I think often, especially for policymakers and politicians, they just ignore those risks because it's easier to just think that the technology will save us.
CCS used to be some kind of far distant dream some years ago. Somebody said it was science fiction. In Norway, we have been developing this technology now for the last 30 years. Our Northern Lights project will be fully operational already next year. And then next phase is coming up by 2030, which will increase the annual capacity to 40 million tons of CO2. I believe with the ambitions we have, Norway will become #1 in carbon capture and storage.
A bilateral agreement between Norway and France is bound to accelerate investments in CCS technologies. Despite their shortcomings, interest has spiked, the IPCC warning in its latest report that the use of carbon removal was unavoidable to achieve net zero.
The Longship and the Northern Lights has been supported by the Norwegian government, at least 2 billion euros. So it's quite a lot of money, but it will be more expensive if we can't combat climate changes. Norway is very happy that COP28, the climate summit in Dubai, agreed first time ever to transition away from petroleum and fossil fuels. And as the largest producer of gas in Europe, that means that we will go through a massive transformation over the next years. And that's why we are investing heavily now in carbon capture and storage, offshore wind, hydrogen, batteries, all kind of new technologies that will pave the way for renewable solutions. Honestly, when we will ask our kids and our grandchildren in the next 10 or 15 or 50 or maybe 100 years, and they ask us, how did you solve the climate crisis? How did you combat the climate crisis? I don't think they will be so concerned about what kind of technologies we chose. I think they will be more focused on that we actually met the expectations.
The fact that Total, Equinor and Shell are the ones that are financing this project also just gives to show that they are using it as a way of prolonging the industry instead of actually looking into real solutions, which we know what is, and that is to phase out the use and the production of oil and gas. Many have this image of Norway as a very green and climate-friendly country. And the truth is basically the entire Norwegian climate policy is pretty much based on hypocrisy, because it is based on us continuing being a big oil and gas supplier to the world. Recently, the Norwegian government launched a new licensing round for oil and gas in the Arctic. So this all gives to show that Norway is using carbon capture and storage, blue hydrogen, all these technology fixes as just a way of greenwashing our policies.